Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you in our first introductory webinar about exploring the 13 principles of agroecology. My name is Paola Migliorini. I am president of Agroecology Europe and researcher at the University of Gastronomic Science in Pollenzo, Italy. So we are very happy to open the October 2021 as our month of agroecology. So there will be a series of different webinars, and today is the first. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Yeah, very briefly, Agroecology Europe is a non-profit association that we established in 2016 in order to place agroecology high in the European agenda of sustainable development of farming and food system. And so our idea is to diffuse and disseminate interaction between different actors, so science, practice, and social movements, with the aims to analyze, design, develop, and promote the transition towards agroecology-based agriculture and food system. And so we do different activity, networking. The next forum will be in November in Barcelona, 18-20 of November. So I invite all of you to participate and come, and so to share knowledge. Next, please. So I'm going to introduce you the three speakers. Yes, so as I said, no, it's okay. Sorry. The three speakers of today. So I'm very honored. We have three experts within the panel of experts of HLPA. So I welcome and thanks Fergus Sinclair. He's chief scientist at the Center of International Forest Research, World Agroforestry, based in Nairobi, Kenya. Then I welcome Rachel Betzner-Kerr, professor of global development at Cornell University, US, although at the moment she's in France. And Alexander Wetzel, vice president of Agroecology Europe and research director at ISARA Lyon, France. So I give you the floor to Alexander to open this month of agroecology webinar.
Thanks, Paula, for the introduction. So the outline will be that we quickly show a little bit about the development of the agroecological principles over the last years. Then, of course, say a few words about the 13 principles, and then about the CSS process, which ended up in the 13 principles. Then looking at the principles and how they relate for the transition to sustainable food systems. Make a little bit a new thing, which we haven't done before, looking at the principles and in relation to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And at the end, looking a little bit at the policy arena and how these principles are taken up already by different policies. Next slide, please. So, well, the challenges we have today in the world is we have, well, in our food systems, still current widespread malnutrition and poverty. And we are also exceeding our planetary boundaries. And on the other side, we have people which are overweight. Terms you heard a lot, I think, as well, that we have a biodiversity loss, nitrate in groundwaters, we have problems with too much pesticides, which also contaminate our foods, then food loss and food waste, but also the question of governance and power concentration in certain supply chains. And then, well, we deal with this later contribution to climate change. So the conclusion, of course, and I think we share this conclusion, is that we need the transformation of our food systems, and which are then really affecting what people eat and how it is produced, transported, processed, and sold. And in respect to these challenges, well, agroecology and the approaches in agroecology were rising really in prominence in the last 5 years, particularly, even if agroecology started already many, many decades ago. Next slide, please. So agroecology, we can call it a dynamic concept, which expanded, well, formerly from field and farm to now to the whole food system. And we can outline three major elements or manifestations. So, well, as a science, a transdisciplinary science, but also as seen as a set of practices which use in the best way ecological processes and ecosystem services. And there are generic principles, but they are applied always context specific. So there is no prescribed set. And social movements is another part of agroecology. While often political movements, they assert for collective rights and well, specifically for smallholder farmers, and also food sovereignty. And while they advocating is for diversity in agriculture and food systems. Next slide, please. Now we're starting with the 13 principles. Next, please. So if we look very quickly at the historical evolution when these principles were defined and came up. So the first ones were more related to the dimension of agricultural and environmental parts, started in the mid-1990s, and then more recently social and cultural and economic principles were defined, and very recently came up also some political principles. Next slide, please. So I thought it's good to see a little bit how this developed. This was never presented so far anywhere, so that's completely new also today, at least from my side. And I was asked by my students to do it also. So there are the first ecological principles come in fact from LASA, so it's low in external input and sustainable agriculture, which were written by Rangers in early 1992. And exactly these 5 principles were taken over by Altieri in his book, and then called Ecological Principles for Design and Management of Sustainable Agroecosystems. A little bit later, he and Clara Nichols modified slightly 2 of the principles. Next slide, please. And now in the mid-2010s, there were some socioeconomic principles which were defined or proposed by Stassard et al. And Dumont et al. In 2012 and 2016. Then some principles for agroecological animal production by another Dumont et al. So in 2013. And then finally, Clara Nichols and Miguel Altieri and others, they defined 6 principles, which are very based on the 5 principles they had before. And this was the principles for the design of biodiverse, energy efficient, resource conserving and resilient farming systems. Next slide, please. And more recently, well, with 10 elements defined by FAO in 2018, and in the same year, 20 principles of agroecology defined by SITSE, and they put them into 4 categories: environmental, sociocultural, economic, and political. And the latest ones were the 30 principles defined in the HLPE report, where, well, as you heard before, so Rachel Fergus and others were contributing. Next slide, please. So this gives the overview, starting with 5, then coming to 6, some principles related to livestock systems and socioeconomic, then over the 10 elements, 20 principles, and now more latest, the 13 principles. Next, please. Yes, and starting with them, I will go quickly through them, and we will have time to discuss about them, hopefully later in the webinar. So the first one is about, while using renewable resources as close as much as possible cycles of nutrients and biomass, reduce and eliminate dependency of purchased inputs. One important thing is soil health, of course, and enhancing soil health and functioning, because we need it for plant production, and specifically looking at organic matter management and enhancing soil biological activity. Animal health and animal welfare is a further principle. And the 5th is the biodiversity, which is key for agroecology. And there it's to enhance, well, the diversity of species, functional diversity, but also genetic resources, and well, to maintain them or increase them in different agroecosystems, so over time and over different scales. Next, please. To provide positive ecological interaction, and with this synergy, well, for the different elements of agroecosystems, so plant, animals, trees, soils, and water. but also a seventh principle about the diversified on-farm incomes, especially while for ensuring for small-scale farmers for having greater independence and value additional opportunities, but also to respond to demands from consumers. Then 8, so the first 7 are more at the agroecosystem scale level, and 8 is clearly one of for us the central principle of agroecology, which is enhanced co-creation and horizontal sharing of knowledge. But this includes of local, indigenous, traditional, and scientific knowledge and innovation, and should be sufficient, especially carried out through farmer-to-farmer exchange. Then 9 will be building food systems which are based on culture, identity, tradition, gender, and equity of local communities to provide good, diversified, healthy, and seasonal and culturally appropriate diets. Next, please. And fairness, while that we have fairness by supporting dignified, robust livelihoods for all actors, which are in this, engaged in these different food systems. Again, specifically for small-scale food producers, and assuring that there is fair trade, fair employment, and fair treatment of intellectual property right. And coming back again, better to connect producers and consumers and ensure proximity and confidence, which can be oriented especially in promoting fair and short distribution networks and re-embed food systems in local economies. And we have this, especially this question during the COVID pandemic. Then recognize and support really the interest of family farmers and smallholder farmers and peasant farm producers, as they are sustainable managers really of land and natural resources, and they govern this in the best way. And the last one is, really to have participation in decision-making by food producers and consumers and enlarge this, and support also a decentralized governance and local adaptive management. Next, please. Yes, with this I hand over to Fergus, which will say a little bit something about the CSF process and how it ended up in these 13 principles, which was not an easy task, he will tell you probably.
And Alex, I'm going to have to be quite careful because I realize that Shiny Vargas is joining us. And of course, she was one of the steering committee members of HLP, so she can correct me if I go wrong. But yeah, it was. I think it was a very, very difficult process to write a report. So that there were initially problems with the whole way in which the report was structured. The commissioning of the report was structured around agroecological and other innovative approaches, because to get agreement within the Committee on World Food Security with all the different countries with different interests, there was a concern about whether agroecology should be given a space by itself, or whether it needed to be related to very many other things. So it started from a difficult space. And there is actually a paper by Anderson et al. In Frontiers, one of the Frontiers journals, where there's actually an analysis of the framing of the report and the way in which the reaction to the first version of the report, which went out to open consultation, happened. So I think we should be really clear that a report like this is the result of a huge amount of effort. 10 authors who were the project team, who were selected for their diversity in terms of the geographies of where they came from, the disciplines that they came from. Everything that we did had to get through a committee of 15 other people, the HLPE steering committee. And it went out to open consultation, the first version. And then after we responded to, I think it was 130 or more responses, including some which came from groups of academics, and that they were as long as the report itself. So incredible amount of scrutiny. Next slide. So you've got this distillation of principles. And I think it's important that within the HLPE process, as Alex was suggesting there, we looked at all of the work that had been done on developing principles and ideas around agroecology before. And we took this idea that principles had to be explicit statements. So those are things that can actually guide action and making decisions. They needed to be explicit statements which could either be causal or normative. So normative statements are where we're saying things should be in a particular way, like, for example, ensure animal health and welfare. That's a normative statement. It's saying that this is the way things should be. But there are also causative elements in the principles, like, for example, that more participation is likely to lead to a higher level of equity in relation to outcomes. So we've got these explicit statements of principles. Now, the really important thing about these principles is that they relate to transforming food systems. And you can't transform a food system immediately with a snap of your fingers. And that's why transition is a really important concept in agroecology. In order to get from where we are now to a desirable future, we need to apply the principles, and they will be applied in sequences and in processes. And many of you will know Steve Gleesman's transition levels. And these relate to starting with making small changes and then leading to making very large changes. But I think what's important about Gleesman's classification is that a lot of the principles, maybe a little bit more than half, 7 of them, really relate to agroecosystem management. Things like biodiversity, reducing inputs, particularly environmentally disruptive inputs, soil health, animal health, recycling and the synergy, the managing of the interactions amongst these things, and to some extent economic diversification. These are all at the agroecosystem level. But then we've got those higher level principles, which are about the way in which food systems are organized. What's the governance of genetics? What's the governance of the way in which markets operate in food systems? How are producers and consumers connected? Who participates? Who has the agency to make decisions about how food is produced, processed, transported, and sold? The key issues of fairness. And fairness was one of the most difficult things to get through the HLPE process because it was somehow considered not to be a scientific concept, which of course we did not think was right. It's as scientific as anything else. Things can be fair and they can be unfair. And I think we can look and people can judge fairness from the different perspectives that they may have. Next slide, please. So the concept of transition is all about pathways. How do you get from where we are now to where you want to get to? And we can think of this in relation to intensification in respect of different factors. So natural ecosystems, up in the top left of the graph here, have got obviously high biodiversity and a very high dependence on ecological processes. If we look at traditional farming systems around the world, they tend to have a lower biodiversity, and quite obviously, and you've substituted some ecological processes with agricultural innovations. And then as you move on the lower axis from more natural, low level of human control, low food productivity to high human control and high productivity, traditional systems somewhere in the middle there. And then if we think of how you move from traditional systems, you may go towards what we would consider the conventional agricultural systems of today, what's characterized as industrial agriculture, sometimes, and this is capital intensive, and we've got a very high level of human control and a high level of productivity of certain food products. Sustainable intensification does shift us up towards more knowledge and labor intensive systems, but still keeps us at a fairly low level of biodiversity and still substituting a lot of natural processes with industrial chemicals, basically just a more efficient way of conventional agriculture. And then agroecology tends to have more labor and knowledge intensity, a much higher level of biodiversity, and really favoring the use of ecological processes over their substitution by other means. Now, the thing about transitions is that the Gleesman transition levels, where you start from reducing inputs, comes from starting from conventional agriculture or green revolution agriculture in developing countries, but conventional agriculture, industrial agriculture in Europe. And so it starts with reduction of inputs and then gradually moves up into the socioeconomic and governance aspects. And that's a very sensible sort of transition pathway for much of Europe and the US industrialized countries. But we need to be aware that there are many different starting points and many different transition pathways. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, many farmers are not using a lot of inputs, and their problems with sustainability are not to do with the overuse of inputs, but with unsustainable practices. So you need different transition pathways given different starting points and different contexts. Next slide. What we've seen so far was only looking at the production context, but of course, what you need to produce and the demand for agricultural products comes from the people who are consuming them. And that's where agency throughout the food system becomes really significant, because you need to look as much at how people are consuming things and all of those processes in terms of food loss and waste between production through to consumption, what's happening in storage, what's happening in the way that things are processed, packaged, sold. And the issue is the extent to which people can actually exert their preferences for sustainably and equitably produced food. And that's only possible to the extent that people have a choice in what they buy and that they have knowledge about how the food that they are purchasing has been produced. So that tracing and tracking from production through to consumption, and that connectivity between producers and consumers. And then, of course, the choices that consumers make in terms of their diet. And of course, if people choose unsustainable diets in terms of how much energy they contain and how much livestock products they contain and so on, then it's impossible to have a sustainable agriculture. And by the way, livestock are extremely important for agroecology because they're really significant in terms of recycling products. So it's not a question of no livestock, it's a question of how much and how those livestock are integrated into production systems. Next slide. So I just want to finish this little sector with looking at what are the key things that need to change. What are the actions that need to happen if agroecology is going to be widely adopted? And it isn't at the moment. And there are three key areas. There's a need to create a level playing field so that agroecological options can be assessed on a sensible basis with industrial agriculture. And that has three key aspects to it. You need to address market failures. So at the moment, slow variables like soil carbon or soil organic matter simply don't factor into economic decisions because a small change doesn't make an economic difference in the short term. But of course, in the long term, if your soil organic matter collapses, you end up with degraded land. And we need to somehow address these market failures so that the reality of agricultural production is felt, a true costing element, if you like. We have to reform maladapted policies. There are many policies which actually work against the adoption of agroecological practices. For example, there may be restrictions on what trees farmers are allowed to, well, the access that farmers have to trees on their land. There can be, and it can change the designation of land. If you, for example, if you have trees on land, so you're trying to create a more complex system, and you may end up having difficult policy issues associated with it. There may be subsidies for inputs and so on and so forth. And then there is the evidence base. So a recent report by BioVision and FAO showed that generally less than 1% or less than 5% in some of the UN agencies of their resources in agriculture are spent on agroecology as opposed to industrial agriculture. If you've only got 5% of the resources going into something, obviously you've got much less evidence about it. The second key issue is embracing complexity. Now, everybody likes a simple solution. And if you start waving your hands around saying things are complex, it's very difficult to get policymakers to take things on board. But the reality is that you can embrace complexity through relatively simple steps. And there is now a new options by context agronomic paradigm that looks at how performance varies in different farms, rather than trying to look at mean responses. And the point is that there isn't a mean farmer. Well, there may be some farmers who are not very generous, but in terms of responses of agricultural technology options, in general, they vary hugely from one place to another. And what we need to do is not look at means, but look at the variability in different places and where are things working really well, where are they not working so well, so that we can understand. For certain types of people in certain places, one option will work, in other cases it will be something else. And of course, that's best done through participatory work. Now, that connects to the co-learning that Alex was talking about. We need to have a serious reconfiguration of the research and extension system so that local knowledge becomes really important, and the exchange of knowledge amongst people horizontally is important. And finally, we need to connect social movements and science. And our third element is enabling integration. And that's really important, both horizontally across sectors, because agroecology involves environment, agriculture, water, trade, all of these things which tend to be in different ministries. And unless you can get the policies to operate together, then you'll be having incentives that pull people in one direction, pull people in another. So the integrated nature, the systemic approach is hugely important. And then, of course, vertically across scales. And a critical issue is that there are generally no policy instruments or social capital at the local landscape or territorial scale at which most important ecosystem services, your water quality, your water yield, your pollination services, your habitat connectivity, as well as your provisioning services, become manifest and need to be traded off against one another, synergies and trade-offs understood, and those ecosystem services managed at a landscape scale. And unless we start creating those policy structures and social capital at that scale, we won't be able to deliver on agroecology. Thank you. Oh, I'll miss that one because I want Rachel to start.
Thanks, Fergus, and great to hear about that. And I think it lends to the next component of our webinar, which is really, one can't think about the food system and transforming the food system with agroecology without thinking about climate change. And I've just had the privilege of working for the last 3 years after I finished with the HLPE on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2 chapter on food systems, looking at impacts and adaptation and vulnerabilities of the food system. Next slide. So we know if you read any news or think about climate change at all, that it is likely and is already having impact on the food system in multiple and interconnected ways, both in terms of increased frequency of extremes like droughts and floods that may devastate local food production and food diversity, driving up local food prices. But we also know from the rising temperatures in the oceans and ocean acidification that fisheries are disrupted, and that varies by place, where you can have fish moving to other regions, but leaving local communities dependent on fisheries, also devastating. And overall, warming is increasing land degradation and ecosystem health. Next slide. At the same time, agriculture and the way we produce food through conventional means, the kind of industrial model, has significant impacts on climate change and land degradation. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle where you have food systems estimated to contribute about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. And in part, that's through things like the production and distribution and application of synthetic fertilizer and pesticide use. And alongside the impacts in terms of climate change, contributing to climate change, the way we produce food, as Alex was talking about at the beginning of the webinar, is also having devastating impacts on nitrogen pollution, phosphorus pollution from synthetic fertilizer applications, as well as really dramatic impacts on biodiversity loss, with the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in their report recently stating that agriculture is one of the Earth's biggest threats in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this just harkens back to the need to transition to a different kind of agriculture. Next slide. And when we look at the principles of agroecology and what it proposes to do, it operates as a means to strengthen adaptation to climate change in many different ways. One of the ways is by strengthening key ecosystem functions. So by improving pollination services, by increasing soil organic carbon or soil microbial biota, by improving soil health, by increasing biodiversity, by reducing the use of synthetic inputs. So by attending to these principles, you see the strengthening of these key ecosystem functions and ecosystem health. But in turn, having greater biodiversity within our food system increases resilience to extreme events. So things like droughts or floods or cyclones, pest outbreaks. If you have greater diversity of animals and plants on your farm system, but also at the landscape level, you have greater diversity across a landscape, you're likely to be less impacted. And there's been a number of really interesting studies looking at that pre and post different extreme events, and also comparing those farms that are using agroecology methods to those farms who are not. In addition, for farming households, if you're not reliant on just one or two crops or animals for your livelihoods, that also reduces your risk from those extreme events. And so there's that reduction of risk from a human perspective. And a number of studies recently, a number of reviews have really underlined the significance of agroecological principles, particularly biodiversity, but some of these other principles in strengthening climate change adaptation. Next slide. In addition, one thing that's really exciting about agroecology is it offers a sort of win-win solution, or a double bang for your buck, in that not only do you strengthen climate change adaptation, but you reduce climate change mitigation. And there's a number of ways that different agroecological practices can do that. One is through planting more trees and other biomass, increasing biomass production, which increases carbon sequestration and biomass in soil. And another is through reduction of these synthetic inputs. So you're no longer using fossil fuel-based inputs to grow food. Although the database for that is less strong in the global south because of research gaps, there is good evidence for this in the scientific literature. Next slide. And just to say as well, one of the common critiques of agroecology is, does it actually enhance food security and nutrition? Is it viable? Are we going to feed the world, if you will? And Alex and I and a group of scholars, building off of the work that we did for the HLPE, undertook a review looking at the literature for over the last 20 years, and found in our assessment that the majority of studies found significant improvements of food security and nutrition for those studies that were, for those farms and interventions that were using agroecological practices. And interestingly, the more complex the agroecological system was, so the more integration of multiple practices, but also multiple principles, things like co-learning of farmer-to-farmer networks, or addressing social equity within households and farming communities, the more likely the study was to show positive impacts on food security and nutrition. So I think with that, I hand it back over to either Alex or Fergus.
Do you start, Fergus, or should I continue? I can't remember anymore. No, I think it's you.
Right. Okay. This slide I didn't generate, but I can talk to anything, as you know, Alex.
Yes.
So there are there are a whole set of really important aspects that are beginning to come together. There's the Committee on World Food Security, and I'm actually going to give you a roadmap later on that shows how all these things connect, and the United Nations Food System Summit. And it's really important to realize that at the beginning of the UNFSS process, there was no acknowledgement of agroecology, and it essentially only came into the process because of pressure from member states, and partly because a lot of civil society organizations boycotted UNFSS on the basis that agroecology wasn't being taken seriously. Next slide. Now, there was quite a significant analysis of conducive policies for agroecology. And there's a paper that's actually still out for consultation. So if any of you want to comment on it, you're really welcome to do it. It's on the website of the Transformative Partnership Platform for Agroecology. And there were 1,600 registrations for this webinar on policies for agroecology that had key policymakers from around the world, looking at the analysis that the TPP had done on policies that have been set up in order to favour the uptake of agroecology. Now, unfortunately, they haven't been around for long enough to be able to do a really serious analysis of whether they work or not. But there is a very strong analysis of what types of policies are already being enacted in different places and in different contexts. Next slide, please. And thinking about the way that things are changing and the sort of wind of change is blowing through the international environment, because there's been a lot of empty rhetoric, particularly around the United Nations Food Systems Summit, where everybody recognizes the problems that Alexander set out at the beginning of this session. And people say we need a transformation, but what they're actually doing is suggesting solutions which are just tinkering around with the business as usual agriculture. Now, at the side event of the Committee on World Food Security, the Transformative Partnership Platform had a meeting at which the president of Sri Lanka set out a really bold policy of actually banning agrochemical inputs to the country and embarking on a national transformation. Next slide. No, that was the previous one. We need the next one. Ah, there we go. So here's a sort of roadmap that leads you from the HLPE report through the development of the Transformative Partnership Platform, the paper on the principles, a launch at UNEA sponsored by UNEP, the critique that we saw of the HLPE report, the CFS 48 adopting the policy recommendations. Now, this is really significant. So this is the first time that an international body has adopted agroecology as a key contributor to transforming food systems. And we had the key Sri Lankan commitment to doing that nationally. Interestingly, IFAD highlighted that the HLPE report was a key reference to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. The one CGR, very resistant to agroecology until recently, selected an agroecology initiative as one of the things it will fund going forwards. And the EU invested in some key webinars looking at new holistic metrics. We had that policies meeting, and then a call for the UN Food Systems Summit to adopt the 13 principles, which was signed by more than 1,800 organizations and individuals. And then pressure from member states resulted ultimately in a plenary session at the last minute getting into the pre-summit of the UNFSS, and a parallel session was really highly acclaimed that Rachel gave a superb exposition on the principles. And then we had the TPP event on agroecological control of fall armyworm, the launch of the Million Voices Citizen Science Initiative launched at the side of the UNFSS, and ultimately the strongest outcome by far from UNFSS is the Coalition to Transform Systems Through Agroecology. So starting from being basically ignored, you've ended up with agroecology being supported by more countries and more organizations, including FAO, IFAD, the World Food Programme, and the United Nations Environment Programme. So a huge success in terms of going from nowhere to a change, a transformation at the UN level. And I can see that Alexander has coming up and he wants me to shut up. So over to you, Alex.
I said just the time is advancing, so we have to do very shortly. So I will also do it much shorter. So it's just the last slide about also to put it into the European context. So there are already elements which are taken up now from agroecological principles or approaches in EU policies, like the farm to fork strategy, the biodiversity strategy, but also more recently when discussing how to integrate the eco schemes in the common agricultural policy. And there is a list of practices which could support these eco schemes, and there are many of these agroecological practices, and more specifically agroecology mentioned. So, and in addition, there is a European partnership in agroecology, living labs and research infrastructures, which should be launched in 2023 with the contribution of the EU Commission and the member states. So also at the European level, there is much more movement, a political movement also in integrating some elements of agroecology in their approaches. Next slide, please. Yes, thanks for the attention. And in the name of Rachel and Fergus and me, and the time is a little bit short, but we are happy to answer to your questions, or if we have discussions more openly, of course.
Thank you, all the speakers. So I thank you, Alex, Rachel, and Fergus. Yeah, time is fly. On the other hand, we have one large question with 3 sub-questions. So I thanks all the also people that are the participant. So Pierre asked 2 questions. The first question is if we have let's say we will share paper, or anyhow if you have in mind relationship of the impact of agroecology practice on productivity, profitability, and labor in semi-arid or subhumid or humid tropics. And the second question is related to the organic IFAM principle. Maybe the second question, if you want, I can also say something, but it's not, let's say. So maybe the first question.
Yeah, well, it's not easy to say. There's already a paper which includes all this, and specific for semi-arid areas. There are different papers which have elements in it, but I, at least from my side, I cannot say which one is the only one which would be summarizing all this which you mentioned in the question. I don't know if Fergus has well, he knows also many papers for the semi-arid regions, as ICRAF is also working in these regions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and related to IFAM organic, it's up to you if you want.
No, you can say something.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, let's say basically I was in the IFAM board for 16 years, I think. So let's say the 4 organic principles are, first of all, let's say 4. So, but yeah, they were developed. I think to go to the point, I see a lot of synergies and let's say overlapping. Or anyhow, I think we go exactly in the same direction. So the principles are the IFAM principles are very complete, very holistic. Anyhow, Alex and we wrote a paper in 2017 comparing agroecological and organic principles. So maybe I can share in the chat the paper, the specific paper about it. Okay. But basically, let's say there is a lot about the principle. There is a lot in common, much more in common than in diversity. Then in the specific practice, there are some differences. Then Fabrice asks, is regenerative farming a subset of agroecology? So the word agroecology and regenerative, how do you see it?
Let me take that one. So when we were developing this solution cluster within the United Nations Food Systems Summit, it was originally called Agroecology and Regenerative Agriculture. And there was a lot of discussion about this, because while there is a big overlap between the two, there's quite a lot of regenerative agriculture which could be seen as greenwashing, because you've got quite big companies investing in essentially slightly more efficient industrial agriculture, rather than really addressing the issues around trying to produce food in ways that doesn't involve polluting the environment. So polluting the environment a little less, so being slightly more efficient in the way you do things, is not really addressing the sort of the key issue. So the way we resolved it was to say, look, well, we've got these 13 principles, so we're very happy to incorporate regenerative agriculture in agroecology where it respects those 13 principles. And that's why the principles are really significant and important, because it allows you, because they're explicit, because they're clear, it allows you then to define what is agroecology and what is, well, you know, not in a prescriptive way, because how those principles are operated in any particular locality depends on the co-creation with that local community. But the principles have to be respected, and that's really been an important development. And so I think, you know, I can't over stress the importance of the existence of principles that you can agree with or disagree with, but they're explicit, and therefore, you know, you can decide what to, whether that is what you want to sign up to or not. And so some regenerative agriculture will be agroecological, and other elements, I'm afraid, will not. And that the same with sustainable agriculture and various other aspects. There's overlap, but there's not a complete, they're not the same. And it's very, those distinctions are extremely important. Thanks.
Thank you, Fergus. There are other two questions, anyhow, comment in the chat that refer to the upstream of the food chain. So let's say from one side, they say, no, we can influence a little bit the farmer, now with policy, with subsidies, with the cap in Europe and so on, but it's much more difficult to tackle the upstream. So the supermarket chains, let's say the upstream of the chain. So how can we involve consumer and in particular the governance and participation of the let's say concentration about retails? So what policy or governance can we deal with that?
Rachel, maybe you respond.
I responded a little bit in the chat. I think
yes, I saw.
It's a really tough question, Jan, that you've posed to us. And I think, you know, there are laws in place to try to prevent the increased oligopolies that you see, and they're not always followed. So it's a problem both on the input side and on the retail side, not just on the retail side, but we see this immense concentration on the input side as well. And I think it's going to take pressure from civil society to change the concentration of these very large companies and their dominance in the food system, as well as, you know, the political will of governments to take this on in order to change that. And I think agroecology principles like participation and land and natural resource governance get at that to some extent, but it doesn't provide a blueprint for how to do that, and that will really vary by context. So everything from, for example, taxing sugar sweetened beverages, that's one way to reduce the power of some of the large retailers, because that gets at their bottom dollar. But there's many different strategies, I think, that we're going to need to tackle that. That's a massive challenge.
Yeah, we just add here and have informed consumers that they can make good choices, and this is very difficult. We see it because how to let consumers know what they eat and how it is produced and where it is coming from. So this would help a lot, but I think actions or programs in this direction were set up already 20 years ago, but it's still difficult to reach to more than 10-15% of the consumers who make really choices in what they're buying based on how the food is produced.
But Alex, I think there's an important aspect here we need to get clear, and that is that what I think certainly the HLP report was saying is it is the agency of different, so people coming from different contexts are going to have different ideas about what is good. Yeah, so it's not that there is some central idea, this is good and that is bad. And this is where the moralization around food systems is really quite significant, because there are increasing debates now around how food should be produced. Now, a Maasai in northern Tanzania may be eating a lot of livestock product, but actually having a very small overall impact on planetary boundaries. Somebody in the US may be eating a lot of livestock product that has a huge environmental impact. And I think one of the key reasons why agroecology is powerful is because it's applying principles locally and allowing you to develop things which are appropriate both to the local culture and to then addressing global challenges. And this is a complex issue, but it's important that I think that we don't assume that we know centrally what is good. We agree to some principles, and then we try to let them work out locally in terms of what suits people. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Ferguson. There is a chat going on, and maybe I select the last because it's already 8. There is one point from Ruben that deal with the institutionalization of the concept, so the potential pitfall or mainstream, that anyhow also co-optation sometimes. And also, how do you so how this transformation should unite also under the banner of agroecology, also including again regenerative, organic, without not falling into
I think that is a critical it's a really critical issue, because it's not going to help anybody if agroecology remains just a little fringe marginal aspect. It's only going to make a difference to global challenges if it's mainstream. But any form of mainstreaming has this risk that you lose the very elements of the chain. So the question is, and I think it's very serious, it is, are you genuinely challenging the status quo? Are you changing norms? Are you making a difference to the way that the conversation happens? Are you changing things at a high level? But what you have to be really clear about is that you have to be prepared to talk to the people who disagree with you. Because you can sit around talking amongst people who are happy to embrace agroecology, and you'll all agree with each other, and it's fantastic. But what you have to do is take on the people who disagree with you and who are pushing an industrial agricultural model. So I am talking at the moment to Agnes Kalibata. I'm sure some of my colleagues will be very concerned about this. She was the Minister of Agriculture in Rwanda, and the Special Envoy for UNFSS, and the President of the Green Revolution for Africa, Green Revolution for Africa program. And she's now quite interested in agroecological transitions, but for Africa and developed by Africans for an African context. Now, if we can persuade Agnes to encompass agroecology, then that's a big step forward in terms of mainstreaming the way in which things are thinking. And and so I think we need to really engage and not just sort of complain about things, but actually change things. And that's the really important point. And I think that there is a wind of change, and I think there's a real opportunity. And the key thing is to make sure that the greenwashing doesn't overtake that, and that does involve being really rigorous in looking at whether change is genuine or whether it's not. And I think the principles really help us to do that, because you can then say, okay, which of these principles are actually being played out in these changes or not. So I think we have to engage and move.
Can I add just two bits to that, Paula? Just
sure.
I think your example, Fergus, also points to the significance of civil society and social movements, and in keeping agroecology not becoming sort of so institutionalized that it loses the transformational aspects to it. And I think we saw that with the UNFSS, that the critical role that social movements played in pushing for bringing agroecology to the table, but also trying to make sure it was an agroecology that was really transformative and really getting at questions of power inequities and social inequities, and the concentration of the food system as it currently stands being unsustainable and needing to change. So just wanted to say it's that tension, I think, that's really important.
Yeah, I fully agree. So the tension between transformist and reformist, that greenwashing. So it's very, very interesting. So thanks both Fergus and Rachel to this point. Okay, now it's time for closing. So thanks again. I'm sorry that maybe we didn't answer the majority of the question in the chat. Anyhow, there was a nice vibration. So thanks also to again all the participants. And I would like to give a big thanks to the Secretariat of Agroecology Europe, so Elena and Eleonore, that supporting us and organize all these. Of course, again, to all the speakers. And yes, we want to remember you to come to the forum. It will be a very nice event to share knowledge, talk each other. It will be mixed event, part online, part on site. And of course, I welcome you to join the association. Thanks a lot, and good evening to all of you. Thank you very much.